Good afternoon or good evening for some of you. Let me first of all say that I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you, to all of you, wherever you are, about languages, and multilingualism. I would like to thank the Translator Teachers Association for inviting me, and I would like to congratulate them on this initiative. I think it is a very nice and very interesting initiative. And I think the very special circumstances we are having these days are, of course, a big problem, a really big problem, but also offer opportunities like this one, and they have to be enjoyed and exploited. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. I just heard that this talk is being interpreted, so I hope I'll do my best to be not too fast and to be as clear as possible in order to make life easier for my interpreting colleagues or future interpreting colleagues. So I will be talking about multilingualism, languages and multilingualism, as I said. Basically, what I would like to do is I will offer you a series of reflections on language and languages. The main point is that multilingualism is a challenge and language is a challenge. And it is a challenge to be met by everyone, by you and me. When I say everyone, I mean all of us, academics and professionals, students, representatives of international organizations, literally everybody, all of us as human beings, all of us as citizens. How can we meet this challenge? Well, this challenge can be met, as you can see, by raising awareness of language-related issues, by promoting language policies, and by paving the way for what I would call a real culture of multilingualism. These are the main points I will deal with, the main topics I will consider in my presentation. I have more or less 1 hour. The presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, is rather long. I will probably skip a slide or two during my talk, but those are the 4 points I'm going to consider, the 4 areas I'm going to consider. So let me start with multilingualism. Multilingualism is a word that may be used in different contexts because we have different kinds of multilingualism. We have multilingualism of people speaking different languages. We have the multilingualism of institutions, institutions working with several official languages. We have a multilingualism of communication, and that is translation, of course. We have the same content that is conveyed in different languages, translation and interpreting. And we have multilingualism in society. Our societies, our cities are generally multilingual, by which what I mean is that there are several language groups coexisting in the same area. Well, the Earth itself is multilingual with its 7,000 languages or so. But what is interesting is, as I said, societal multilingualism in society. Our countries, our cities are increasingly multilingual and multicultural. As a result of migration, as a result of mobility, the situation in most countries, definitely in Europe, but also elsewhere, is characterized by what has been called super diversity. Plastic example of that in languages over 300. In London, over 300 languages are spoken. So super diversity, as you can see, Deltovich was the one who devised or coined this term. Super diversity requires, he says, very specific policies, very specific multicultural policies. This is, of course, more easily said than done. What is the situation? When we talk about societal multilingualism, what is the situation we have? Well, the situation is basically the one you can read here. There are many people who don't know the local language. Don't know the local language, not yet, not well enough, for whatever reason. Yet they need to communicate with authorities and service providers. And of course, effective communication is only possible if language services are provided, translation and interpreting. I mean, these people can't speak the local language. They need to communicate with service providers. They need translation and interpreting. It is as simple as that. The problem is that language services, translation services, interpreting services are often unavailable or inadequate. This may seem a very brutal statement. All countries are not the same, but in most countries in Europe, language services are often unavailable or inadequate for migrants or for people needing those services. Consequences may, of course, be very serious, in particular in sensitive settings such as healthcare or justice. Just think in terms of personal health, personal freedom, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, when the access to services is limited or even impossible because there is a language barrier, what we have is a sort of discrimination on the grounds of language, which is, of course, prohibited, explicitly prohibited by a number of legal instruments, starting from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So how can this problem be addressed? How can this situation be addressed? Well, of course, translation and interpreting services should be available in all public services. And for that, what is needed is specific policies, and what is needed is specific legislation. There is a good example in Europe with the European Union Directive 2010/64, which introduced the translation and interpreting in all criminal proceedings. In all criminal proceedings, there must be translation, there must be interpreting. Costs are covered by the state. The defendant is entitled to translation of all relevant documents and is entitled to interpreting during the hearings and in his meetings with his counsel, etc., etc. This is a good example. But of course, this should be extended to other areas as well, and I'm thinking of healthcare in particular. The directive has been incorporated into national legislation, so it is a law in all European Union countries now. But, you know, a law is not enough. And even the availability of language services and the availability of translators and interpreters are not enough. Why? Well, because what is needed is not just services, not just interpreters and translators, but what is needed is high quality language services provided by high-quality translators and interpreters. Now, what happens in many countries is that public service providers generally know very little about translation and interpreting. They are not quality aware. They tend to equate speakers with interpreters. You are Russian, so you can be an interpreter for Russian. You are, I don't know, German, then you can be an interpreter for German, etc., etc. Another funny thing, it's not funny at all, but it is curious, it is foolish, and it is dangerous. Public service providers, in particular in the justice sector, don't give information to interpreters. Interpreters are called to court to work in a hearing in the justice system, and they are not informed in advance about the case they are going to work in. All this because people say, judges and legal professionals say, well, why should we inform interpreters about the case? They only have to translate. Please believe me, I've been involved in a number of European studies. I interviewed a number of people, and I heard many times this sentence, they only have to translate. That's why I insist on this point. People are not aware of what language is, of what languages are, of what translation and interpreting are. So they don't give information to interpreters in many cases, also because they don't want to influence in some way the interpreters, which is again very silly. How can you do your job if you're not properly informed, if you don't have the opportunity to prepare? But anyway, interpreters working in public service settings also are characterized by a number of problems and difficulties. They are often untrained and unqualified. They are often non-professionals. Sometimes they have a limited knowledge of the local language. I'm referring here not to interpreters of English or French or Spanish or German. I'm not referring to interpreters of for the languages that are regularly taught at school and at university. I'm referring to interpreters for languages that are languages of limited diffusion, at least in Western Europe. I'm referring to interpreters for certain African languages or Asian languages, etc. They are migrants as well. They are untrained, unqualified, non-professionals, etc., etc. Their role is absolutely fundamental. Their work is very important, no, more than very important, is absolutely crucial. But they simply don't have, the background, the knowledge, etc., to do what they are supposed to do. So quite a lot of problems, and as I said before, the consequences may be very, very serious. How to address the problem? Well, the first thing to do is awareness raising awareness of what languages, translation and interpreting are. This is the only possible way to tackle this problem. Now, a few words about language and languages. I would like very much to carry out a very big awareness-raising campaign about language and languages, because people don't know anything about languages, apart from, of course, the language professionals. But the ordinary people don't know anything about language and languages. Problem is that they think they do. They think they know about language and languages. And of course, this is always very dangerous. Now, what is the first point about languages? Languages are, of course, communication tools, but they are not just that, because languages also have to do with identity, sense of belonging, power, and so on and so forth. And it's always been like that. Languages, as it were, are not innocent. What languages represent may prevail over what languages are. I could give you many examples, but I don't have the time to do so. So just very, very quickly, a few years ago, the Italian education minister authorized the teaching of Slovene as an optional subject in upper secondary schools in Trieste, Italy, my place, Italian city on the border with Slovenia. Many people, many politicians reacted to this decision, saying that the Slovene language is useless. Okay, this was clearly a political reaction, nothing to do with languages, but quite a lot to do with what that particular language represents for many people. The language of the neighbor, the language of the enemy, the language blah, 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 okay? So, the language is useless. How can a language spoken by millions of people, how can such a language be useless? Okay, you'll tell me. But anyway, this is just an example of languages being regarded as not as tools of communication, but as something else. I don't know if you have any experience with the Belgian railway system. This is very fun. This is indeed funny. You know, Belgium is a country that has 3 official languages: French, Dutch, and German. For all intent and purposes, the real 2 official languages are French and Dutch. French is spoken in Wallonia, Dutch is spoken in Flanders, and then in Brussels, both languages are official languages, and so both languages are officially spoken. Trains in Belgium, all communication in the railway system in Belgium takes place in the language of the place where the train of the station is. So you board a train in Flanders and you get communication in Dutch. You enter Brussels, the Brussels area, and you have communication in Dutch and French. You move to the French-speaking part of Belgium and you only get communication in French. So the train is always the same. You have communication first in Dutch, then in both Dutch and French, and then in French only, depending on the area where the train is. And this is, of course, very confusing. You board a train going to Luik, and then all of a sudden you discover that your train is going to Liège, which is, of course, the same place, but okay, the 2 names, Dutch and French. What's the point there? Clearly not providing information, not providing a service to the passengers, but the main point there is to assert some kind of language identity. And in a way, the medium is the message, as sociologist McLuhan used to say in the 1960s and 70s. I think that young people today have a very important role to play. What we call the Erasmus generation of students going around, generation of students studying at least for some months, for some time in a foreign university. They are really very, very important because they go around, they meet people, they understand what languages are, they can help Europe, they can help mankind overcome this kind of nationalist and chauvinist rhetoric surrounding languages, and give languages back the role they should have. I also think that language education is needed. Also to avoid misconceptions and prejudice. Italy is characterized, like perhaps many countries, but Italy in particular is characterized by an overwhelming presence of English, of the English language. There is English everywhere. In public and private communication, you have an enormous amount of English words being used, often mispronounced, but used by all sorts of people. Okay, I remember a couple of years ago there was a letter of an Italian reader to an Italian newspaper, and this reader complained about this overwhelming presence of English in communication in Italy, and he was particularly annoyed also because this man said, the English language is poor and unrefined. Now, poor and unrefined, how can you possibly define as poor and unrefined a language in which some of the great masterpieces of the world literature were written? But anyway, this is what this man said. The English language is poor and unrefined. Okay? Some 15 or 17 years ago, a very interesting book was published in Italy, co-edited or co-written by a physicist and a linguist, two old friends, two almost old people at that time, 15 or 17 years ago, and they were discussing in writing about scientific culture on the one hand and the humanities on the other. Okay, and the good points and weak points, strong points and weak points of the two. Okay, and there is an interesting part of that book devoted to language and languages. Now, the physicist at a certain point says that there are languages that are suited to science and languages that are unsuited to science. Please think about that for a moment. Languages suited to science and languages unsuited to science. And then the linguist, Tullio De Mauro, says that, well, perhaps, I'm not sure, yes, perhaps you're right, but I'm not sure. What is true is that a language such as English is unsuited, this is a quotation, is unsuited to expresses nuances of meaning in political discourse, art, or literary criticism, which in a way is the same as saying that the English language is poor and unrefined. I find this absolutely shocking, and particularly so because it comes from a linguist. Now, I think that all languages can can be used to express just anything. Yes, of course, there are 7,000 languages in the world. There are languages spoken by 100 people. It may be difficult to talk about artificial intelligence in a language spoken by 100 people, but not because of the language, but because that language is necessarily spoken by people who are isolated, etc., etc. I mean, if those people live in the center of Amazonia, I don't know, or in the center of Africa, they have no contact with nobody, etc., then of course it may be difficult for them to talk about artificial intelligence, but it is not, because it's of something inherent in the language itself. I think all languages can be used to speak just about anything. I don't like this idea of languages being specialized for certain kinds of communication. In the 16th century, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, used to say, I speak Spanish to God, French to men, Italian to women, and German to my horse. Of course, nobody knows if it is true or not, or if it is a fake news or whatever. But what is important here is this kind of specialization. All specific contexts seem to be characterized, or each context seems to be characterized by a specific language suited to that particular setting. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. All languages are equal. Yes, perhaps some languages are more equal than others, but all languages are equal, and you can say basically everything in all languages, at least in all languages we speak in Europe, in Western Europe, etc. All languages. Look at this. Do you know that in Finland there is a radio program in Latin? It is called Nunzi Latini, which means something like Latin news. And you have the news, I mean, the current affairs, the world news, etc., in Latin. They have a website, and you can also read the news, not just listen to the news in Latin, but you can also read the news like you read a newspaper. And look at this. This is just an article, an old article. I can't remember the date or the year. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. But anyway, about a meeting of a Russian President Putin and a Chinese President Xi Jinping meeting in St. Petersburg, and etc., etc. And this is a summary of their talks and so on and so forth, and the way in which they dealt with the American attitude and with the dangers of a trade war and so on and so forth. Okay, and they met in Foro Commerciali Petropolitano. They met in Petropolis, which is of course Petersburg, St. Petersburg. Okay, the Latin, the city of Peter's city, etc., etc. So, I mean, Latin can be used to talk about Xi Jinping and President Xi Jinping and President Putin, which means that you can talk. You can use Latin to talk about artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. All languages can be used to talk about just everything. Because basically, and I'm very convinced about what I'm going to say now, some people talk about the limits of a language. But I think that rather than talking about the limits of a language, we should think in terms of the limits of a language speaker. Just as when we talk about the limits of translation, we say, translation, we can't do just everything with translation. There are limits to what translation can do. Well, sometimes the limits of translation are the limits of a translator. So there are limits to what a translator, an individual translator, can do. Well, I would prefer to think in these terms, not limits of a language, but limits of a language speaker, not limits of translation, but limits of a translator. I think this is an important point we should always consider, rather than saying that a certain language is poor and unrefined. Let's think of who the speaker of that particular language in that particular context is. But definitely there is an overwhelming presence of English in private and public communication in Italy, and Italians seem to be very happy with that. I will not deal on this point. I'll just say that English is often seen as a marketing tool. In Italy, it is very much used to show that something is good, something is new, something is modern, something is sophisticated, up to date, etc., etc. Well, English is used, and apparently it is always well received and very all this is very profitable. All this can also be seen in academia. There is a proliferation of courses in English, which are often regarded as sort of proof of internationalization, which again is something I find absolutely ridiculous. Internationalization is something very serious. This is a famous definition of internationalization. You see, the process of integrating an international or intercultural dimension into the teaching, research, and the service functions of the institution. So internationalization is not just teaching in English. Internationalization means also addressing the curricula, addressing the courses, and setting up a very complex academic situation, academic space, which is different from the national one. Okay, international is different from national. This is the point. You don't move from national to international simply by changing the language. And I would like to stress what I think is a clear distinction between internationalization and globalization. Internationalization is very much based on multilingualism and multiculturalism, whereas globalization is very much based on monolingualism and monoculturalism. And we know which is the single language and the single culture that permeates globalization. So internationalization, multilingualism, and multiculturalism, rather than the monolingual and monocultural reality of globalization. Now, the English language, a few words about the English language. The English language, English as the international lingua franca, English as the number one language in the world, etc., etc. Okay. Now, first of all, let me say that a lingua franca is useful. There have always been lingua francas, and English is an excellent lingua franca. It serves very well its purpose as a lingua franca. It plays very well the role of lingua franca for a number of reasons. I don't want to dwell on this point. But everybody speaks English. No, it is not true. It is not true that everybody speaks English. I don't know where you are, but if you go walking through the streets of your place, whether it is Trieste, my place, whether it is Moscow, whether it is St. Petersburg, whether it is Berlin, whether it is Paris, whether it is whatever, you will immediately find that it is not true that everybody speaks English. Okay? Second point, important point, a lingua franca is a foreign language. Okay? We are now communicating in English. We are using, I mean, you and I are using English as a lingua franca. We like it. It is a good way to communicate, but it is a foreign language. For you, for most of you, at least, I don't know, and definitely for me. Okay? Let's keep this in mind. And let's ask ourselves, how much is lost in lingua franca? And how much good research is not published? You know, many articles, even good articles, scientific papers, are rejected by international journals because they are written in poor English, or not very good English, or not excellent English. How much good research is thus lost to the international community? How much is lost in lingua franca in terms of being able to express oneself, in terms of being able to understand what is being said? Let's think about that. How much is lost? Okay? Sometimes we say lost in translation. Okay? Let's think of how much is lost in lingua franca. How much the speaker can't express. How much the listener can't understand. But I said at the beginning, languages are tools of communication. Yes, of course, it is true, but they are not just that, because language is also the tool with which knowledge is constructed. Language is the tool with which ideas are produced. Language determines reality, or if you think that is too much, language determines our perception of reality. We interpret the world through our language. Okay? So, if there is just one language in science, in scientific communication, in quite a lot of, situations, if there is just one language, if only one language is used, there is a big danger, the danger of what in French is called la monoculture de la connaissance de la science, the monoculture of knowledge and science, which is a step towards la pensée unique, the single thought, just one way of thinking, the same way of thinking for everybody. Think about that. It is a danger. A single language is a danger. A single language as opposed to the multiple languages that we have at our disposal. Okay? When I say language education, when we talk about language and languages, we tend to think of foreign languages. We tend to ignore the local languages, the national languages, the mother tongues, etc. But, do you know that 20% of the 15-year-olds are functionally illiterate? So technically they can read and write, but they are not able to write a relatively complex text. They are not able to understand a relatively complex text, not because they have some kind of, cognitive deficit, but simply for because the language knowledge is not enough. And do you know that 80% of aspiring European Union conference interpreters fail their accreditation tests, not because they are not good at interpreting, not because they don't know things they should know, but simply because their command of the mother tongues is not good enough. You see, and these are interpreters, okay, wishing to work in Brussels. And they are 80% of them are rejected because they are not good enough. Not as interpreters, but as speakers of their own languages. Impressive, isn't it? Final point, final chapter in this very, very quick run through multilingualism, translation and interpreting. The good news is translation and interpreting are more needed than ever. And they are needed for communication, because not everybody speaks English. They are needed for the quality of communication, because quite a lot is lost in lingua franca. For the enforcement of rights, think of migrants, as I said in the first part of this talk. And translation and interpreting are needed for multilingualism, to really enable our societies, our countries, to be multilingual, really multilingual. Good news number 2, the market is expanding. If you look at statistics, if you look at figures, you can see that the market translation and interpreting business has been on the increase for the past several years. So, you know, people thought that globalization, the emergence of English as lingua franca, would make translators and interpreters redundant, would lead to the cancellation of translation of interpreting. No, those people have been proven wrong, because translation and interpreting are still going strong, as it were. Now, of course, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, machine translation, machine interpreting. There is something called crowdsourced translation. I don't know how this is going, how this what the situation in this respect is in your countries, but there is quite a lot of crowdsourced translation, you know, translation made by people, ordinary people, readers, etc., etc. It all started with the translation of subtitles of some Japanese, I think, or American, I don't know, cartoons, and then it has become it has expanded to literature as well. Children literature, Harry Potter, for example, was famously crowd translated, and so on and so forth. How much quality is there? We can give a book to 25, 50, 2,000 readers and say, please translate this, and then somebody puts everything together and comes up with the final version. Is this better than a professional translation? Who knows? It depends. Crowdsourced translation is used by Twitter, for example. It is used by several social media companies, and so on and so forth. But there is a question mark: how much quality? How much quality there is in translation and in machine translation and interpreting? Again, there are very, very funny examples and very funny translations. You can find, if you use one of those automatic translators, but of course, machine translation is used because for certain kinds of texts, it is good, etc., etc. But how much quality there is in general, this is another matter. So technology and the growing importance of technology leads to the question, are translators and interpreters endangered species? Which is a very interesting question, isn't it? Not easy to find an answer. Let me ask you a different question. Does the world need trains, planes, or rockets? The answer is no. The world does not need rockets, planes, or trains. The world needs means of transport. And whether it is horses or horse-drawn carriages or bicycles or cars or trains or planes, etc., it depends on technology available, it depends on costs, it depends on efficiency, effectiveness, and of course, it depends on quality. And the same is true for translators and interpreters. Does the world need translators and interpreters? No, is the answer. The world needs translation and interpreting, which is a little bit different. And whether it is humans or machines, again, it depends on technology, costs, efficiency, effectiveness, and again, crucially, quality. What about machines? What about technology? Humans or machines? It depends on blah, blah, blah. Now, what about machines? I said machines are used, machine translation is used, machines are used. We are using machines here, by the way, now. Pandemics, COVID-19, whatever, we are all teaching online. We are doing exams online. So technology is there. Machines are okay as an aid for translators, as an aid for interpreters, but can they take over? Can they provide the same quality? Who knows? But this is the real question. Can they provide the same quality? Because this is what really matters, okay? Quality. If the quality is not good, nobody will resort to machines. If the quality is good, if the quality is comparable, then of course things are completely different. Can they take over? What about quality? Well, I don't know. I really don't know. But I have serious doubts, in particular for interpreting. I have serious doubts. What about sensitive settings? What about interpreting in healthcare? What about interpreting in court, where health is at stake, where personal freedom is at stake? Would you entrust your health or your personal freedom to a translating and interpreting machines? You definitely entrust your health to machines already, clearly. But what about interpreting or translation? It's a different matter. And what about the imperfection? A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, said, machines are beautiful, but machines have a fundamental defect. They're not able to deal with imperfection. They work perfectly if things go perfectly, if everything is fine. But if something is wrong, if something goes wrong, if something is not perfect, what can machines do? And humans are imperfect by definition. Communication is imperfect by definition. We make mistakes, pronunciation, grammar, syntax, slips of the tongue, etc., etc. By and large, communication between humans works well. In spite of all that, we are used to dealing with imperfection. What about machines? Self-driven cars, automated cars, how these are perfect, absolutely fantastic, if only self-driven cars are around. Self-driven cars and man-driven cars together, well, that's absolute chaos, because the self-driven car is not able to foresee, understand, anticipate the behavior of the drivers, of human drivers. So what about imperfection? Can machine interpreting deal with imperfection? I have serious doubts about that, which leads to the conclusion that languages, multilingualism, including translation and interpreting, are a challenge indeed. And as I said before, it is a challenge to be met by all of us, starting with awareness raising. If you are listening to this talk, you are interested in translation, interpreting, and languages, please start raising awareness about languages, translation, and interpreting. Please try and tell people who are outside our world, outside our professions, tell them what language and languages are and what translation and interpreting are. And the moment they understand, the moment they learn, then things will definitely be better. It's 5 to 6 for me. I think this is all I wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think that I believe all my colleagues are applauding you now. We cannot express it as loud as we could have if we were in person, but thank you so much. We are really grateful. Yes, you can see in the chat. Colleagues, if you have any questions, please write them in the question section. There is one. The question we received is, dear Maurizio, what is your attitude to studying the dead languages? But it was received before you gave the example of Finnish newspaper in Latin, right? So
yes, well, my attitude. Yes, well, I can answer. I studied 5 + 2. I studied Latin for 7 years and ancient Greek for 5 years. All this not at university, at school, before university, because my school, the type of school I attended is what we call liceo classico, and that is the kind of secondary school that has an emphasis, places an emphasis on the humanities. So quite a lot of literature, quite a lot of Latin, Greek, and so on and so forth. And that was the kind of school, by the way, that most translators and interpreters attended before studying translation or interpreting. It is typical. Things may have changed recently. So that is my experience. What is my attitude? Well, good. I mean, excellent idea to study dead languages. Why not? First of all, because they are not dead after all. Because if you can write about Putin meeting Xi Jinping This means that they are not dead languages. You can do whatever you wish. You know that in Finland, they used to write PhD dissertations in Latin, still in the 19th century. Okay, they were still.
That was not long ago, actually.
And it is pretty recently, 100 years ago, etc. And then it gives you quite a lot of logical way to approach languages, in particular languages with many cases. I think you are familiar with cases. Oh yes, I will suggest and invite aspiring translators and interpreters to study Latin and ancient Greek. I don't know anything about Church Slavonic languages, but Latin and Greek definitely. My daughter studied Latin and Greek as well.
And as a teacher of Old English, history of the language, I mean, Old English is also very interesting and inspiring, and it gives understanding how the language evolves, how it develops, what is its inner logic, and it gives possibilities to explain what happened.
Yes.
And I know there are lots of videos which involve Old English, for example. My students find lots of them, actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, English is very nice. English is a language I love. Mm-hmm. But when my students are lazy, and tend to use silly English words, replacing perfectly ordinary and perfectly useful Italian words, I say, my dear, but why are you using this English word? Just please tell me why. I'll give you just one example. Location, okay? Now we have a number, like any language in the world, we have a number of words. We can say posto, we can say luogo, we can say località. We have a number of words, depending on context, to say place, okay? And you have, now for whatever reason, if you listen to the radio, if you watch TV, you hear Italians saying location, speaking Italian and saying the English word location. When I have my students say in the booth location, I mean, that's too much. I say, please tell me why. Please tell me why.
Just a fashion.
If you give me a convincing reason why you say location, you can go on saying location throughout your life. But please tell me why. And of course, nobody can give a reasonable explanation for that. Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Maurizio.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you.
We are so pleased to be able to listen to your nice talk today.